wildlife habitat garden ponds. And I'm going to ask that everyone mute themselves as well as take off your video. Erin's a little concerned about her bandwidth. So anyway, if everybody will mute, and we will have Erin come on. You can share your screen now, Erin, unless you want me to share it.
Oh, no, that sounds good. Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me do that. Let's see. All right. Do you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yep.
So thank you all for being here this morning. I'm a private lands biologist. So for work, I mostly work on larger lands and land management, less yards and kind of landscape design in that sense. But I do think that yards are really valuable for conservation. You can do quite a bit on your own property, even if it's smaller, less than an acre size, things like that. I've worked on that myself and have been able to attract lots of wildlife to my yard. And I think one of the best ways to do that is with a pond. Why isn't this moving? Okay. So yes, wildlife habitat ponds are one of the best things you can do to your yard if you're interested in attracting wildlife, or even in, creating more places for different native plant communities. Having just water in your yard at all is going to attract wildlife, and there's ways that we can refine it to make it even more valuable. So yeah, we have ponds sometimes for different reasons. Since this is Native Plant Society, we're going to focus a little bit more on the plant part of that than the wildlife, but we're thinking of plants both as structure for wildlife and then plants as themselves too, in their own inherent value. But one reason ponds are so important is because they are these little ponds, these little
we've lost you.
To add that on your own landscape or in your yard. So a lot of the rare and endangered plant and animal species that that we think about here in Georgia and just in the US, they rely on wetlands either to live there, to visit, or to reproduce. So some life stage is connected to these little ponds. And historically, these ponds are created, over geologic time in different ways that we tend to, we're not creating a lot more of them. Just the way we use land, some of those ways that ponds used to be created are not happening anymore. So we're just losing ponds, basically. So you can make a really big impact by putting these ponds back out on the landscape. These are going to attract birds, small mammals, all sorts of things, but so it's great to, see the wildlife, but kind of the same way that we promote native plants, where we would say, yes, it's nice to have nectar plants, to see the pollinators and things like that. We would also provide host plants so that you can provide for a different stage of life. So that's what you would be doing if you put a pond in. That's how you're helping amphibians and invertebrates, especially. So yeah, the idea of this, I mentioned no fish. You'll see in this illustration up here, there's no fish in here, and you've got so many different interactions going on between the plants and animals, between the animals and animals. Ponds are incredible places. So I guess all ponds are incredible places, but there are certainly degrees of incredible, and these do not do it for me. And these don't really do it for wildlife. You've got a farm pond with some cows around it on the left, no difference, no variation in structure. It's just it's just a big open pond with not a lot of different plants and nothing inside of it. And then on the right, you have something that might be relaxing to people to hear the sound of water, but the koi fish and the fountain and especially down here, a pile of rocks everywhere. That's not what we think about with natural, coastal plain ponds. And it's not going to provide, these aren't going to provide a lot of value to wildlife. Some, absolutely, you'll get some visitors, as water is going to attract anything. But we're going to look at some ponds that actually meet some criteria to support native wildlife and not just attract them, ephemerally. So 4 to 6 hours of sun is a good characteristic for if you're thinking about where to put these ponds in your yard. These ponds aren't going to be very deep. Usually about 2 to 3 feet is good enough. That's where you're going to find the most diversity in species using them. And it also, when you've got that big open area, how many plants are you going to have out there? Just the surface ones. And so having that depth is important. You don't want any shallower than that, really, because you won't get much of a thermal gradient. So it needs to be cooler at the bottom, and plants can help make it cooler, but also just having it deeper is going to help with that. Gradual sloping edge is what we think about with natural ponds, where they would basically be located at a low spot. And so you have changes in soil moisture too that kind of lead you to this pond where you have a wetter edge. And so that's a cool thing for, different plant communities at that ecotone there. But also wildlife need that sloping edge, small wildlife, to get in and out of ponds. If you don't have a sloping edge, if it's just a steep drop, you're really eliminating a lot of kind of critical habitat for things that are, trying to metamorphose, small critters again. But then birds too. Birds will enjoy having a sloped edge and places they can stand on. Think about whether you're going to, if you're doing a lot of fertilizing upland of the pond, you don't want that runoff going into your pond. Sometimes you make some trade-offs. If you've got a rain barrel that's, running off of your roof, maybe that's going to be okay, but do make that a consideration when you think about where to put a pond. A mostly vegetated perimeter is going to be important. A lot of people have a beautiful pond and then they mow it right up to the edges. And all of that could be important cover. It could also be cool, unique plant zones. So we want to leave cover in there. The idea is with these ponds, you can embed them in your garden. And then providing cover objects that can be in the way of, occasional stones, rocks, but logs. Those are really good and natural objects that you can find. I've seen artistic brush piles used. So if the look of your garden is makes you think you don't want a brush pile, Google some artistic brush piles. They're out there. And then, a variety of plant structure around these ponds, which we sure didn't see with the other 2 ponds we looked at. And then, people think that the way to finish their pond is to add fish in a fountain. And I encourage you not to do that, because you're really, these spots would not naturally have had fish for the most part. The fountain disrupts the water surface. This still water is where most of the life is in these ponds. Those are areas where animals can lay eggs. Dragonflies, think about that, and frogs. So they need these quieter, stiller areas for developing and reproduction. And even for calling, things like that, communication can be interfered with through fountains splashing around. So the idea is to try to, this could be a pond edge, a lake edge, this could be a lot of things here, but I do like all of these different zones here, and trying to think about how you can squeeze this down into a little pond in your yard. And I'm saying little pond, like a little, a bathtub sized pond can still have all of these things. So if you're just getting started, the plants that I would recommend would be emergent plants, things that come out of the water with these stalks and flowers. These are entry and exit ways for animals. And then marginal plants, which would be some of those cover plants that you would find around the edges. So I'll show you some more ideas later, but having some ferns and tall brushy stuff, things that when an animal is entering the pond or exiting, they can feel safe doing so. And then to add more wildlife, to attract more wildlife, floating plants and submerged plants. A lot of these critters, algae is kind of the foundation of life in these ponds. So you do want some amount of algae. Keep in mind though that as soon as you start attracting more wildlife, they're going to kind of have an effect on that algae, and they'll keep it in check, or you can add more plants to help keep it in check and just kind of steal the nutrients away from the algae. And then for perimeters, again, thinking about the entry and exit for ponds for these small animals that will use them so that it's safe for them. You don't want just a bunch of stones around the edge. That stones heat up a lot in summer, especially in South Georgia, stones and bricks. So make sure that there's a part of your pond that has soft logs or dirt. Just bare dirt is good in some places. Those are, we know, valuable for ground nesting bees and butterflies and things like that too. So try to incorporate that and some of these other materials into your edges of your ponds. The rock surfaces are good because they do, heat up, and basking is really important to amphibians and reptiles. But we don't want that to be the only option. So here are some, you can't see this part. Let me see. Sorry. Trying to get this out of your way. Some different plants that I've used in ponds, or I've recommended people use in ponds, and I think there's that it's been working pretty well for people. And then for the margins of the ponds, you'll think about some plants that are not going to want as wet of feet. And so there's tons of different plants that you could use, but these are just some of them that I think most of them are pretty easy to get. Maybe a few of these are not. I mentioned Fewflower milkweed because I think it's beautiful, and I'm trying to work on it and put it in a pond right now. We'll see how it works out next year. But a lot of these you can definitely buy at native plant stores. So there's a lot of different ways to build a garden pond, and you're basically just finding different ways to get a hole out there that has water in it, that has plants around it and in it. So I'm just going to give you one way, just so you have something to go on. But first off, site selection, and a big part of site selection here is your objectives for that pond. Are you trying to attract a certain type of wildlife? Are you trying to host certain native plant communities? Do you want a bog garden to be part of it, for example? And also just the property that you have. Who are you likely to attract given your landscape? So then after you've thought long and hard about that, and also, I guess, well, I'll get into that in a bit. So dig it out, sit on that for a while, look at the pond, see what kind of adjustments you might need to make. And then you can install your pond liner, which can be either a mold or a flexible pond liner, which I'll show you in a bit. If that is a flexible pond liner, you would probably want to put down a layer of sand or maybe old carpet, something like that, so that you don't have any punctures to that liner. And then let it fill with rainwater and eventually plant it. I say enjoy for 5 to 10 years. I've enjoyed a pond longer than 5 years, but just in case, especially if it's a smaller pond, you might want to revamp it. You will notice that since this pond isn't going to be drying down, it is going to gear itself towards being habitat for certain types of animals over others. So you can kind of reset that cycle. Basically, if you just have a pond and don't let it dry down and fill up at some point, it's going to be, if it just stays permanent water, you'll have a bullfrog pond with less diversity. Kind of the bullfrog takes the place of the fish in this case. So site selection, just some considerations that we want to think about. This is a pond I used to have. That's my dog entering part of it over there. Drainage. This is a low area of the yard, so you can see that it doesn't have a rim coming up above ground. So water that's moving down is going to catch into this pond, so I don't have to water it as much. So that's great. I didn't have any problems with tree roots here, but I did place it in the shade, or partial shade. So that I definitely am glad I did that. If you're going to have to put it in full sun, you'll need it to be a little bit deeper than even those 2 to 3 feet probably. And yeah, this is another one. So again, your objectives with your pond are going to fit into your site selection and the type of pond that you create. This pond is a native plant gardener's pond, but he's also an ornithologist, a very excited birder. And he's got so many species that he's found in this yard since he installed this. It's actually more of a stream. And so this, unlike the other ponds we're going to talk about, does have, a pump and filter and things like that. And it's great for native plants. And if you are trying to just attract birds to your yard, this will do that job, certainly. But we're also focusing a little bit more on ponds that can support wildlife and rare plant communities through offering a service, that's not necessarily out there. But this is great. I hope he also has another pond too for the frogs and dragonflies and everything else. Here's a pond I helped give advice for. They basically just wanted some, this is for aesthetics. So they wanted to have a place mostly for plants and add some color. So it's just green right here. This is where they dug it out. But this is going to be pickerel weed with some really pretty purple flowers. And then these are some different irises. And these will fill in a pond very quickly. I don't think I mentioned that on the other list, but I did put a couple asterisks by species on that main list. And that was to remind you that if you have a small pond, that might be one of your only plants in there. So keep that in mind. Let's see. And then here's a pond. This is Heather's pond, actually, that she's been working on. And she wanted to create a pond near the house. She has natural ponds out there too, but near the house where she could kind of showcase some of her native plants that have more specialized habitat requirements. So she does have this shelf that she's working on and these pitcher plants, and this is all in progress, but she's got submerged plants too, this eelgrass, and it's coming along really well. And she has since, I think, planted a lot of ferns around the side. We'll have to get some more updates. And this is called a frog pond. It does have a 4.5-foot alligator that lives in it. This is another birder biologist, but he was trying to put in a pond for frogs, and you don't ever get just frogs. You get a lot of other things. So he has a mix of native plants and non-native plants. He acknowledges that he has some invasive plants that he's working on getting out of there. So all of these ponds, every pond can be better. But this is pretty cool that he has this in his backyard. He's had an otter. He has otters visit. He has newts that make their way into the pond. So really cool. So you can dig a pond, or you can have a container pond. There's definitely more value to these ponds that are level with the surface, but container ponds are great. Tree frogs are going to get in your container ponds too. And container ponds, if plants are more your concern, then it doesn't matter if they're above ground so much or below. You do limit the amount of, that kind of ecotone, the gradual change in soils, because you can have wetter soils at the edge and, have a plant community that represents that. But I have plenty of these out in my yard right now too. You can, if you're not allowed to dig, you can build up a raised bed and then dig into that. That seems like it follows the rules, I think. Or you can have the most flexibility with putting a pond liner in the ground, one of those flexible rubber or non-toxic plastic pond liners into the ground to get your shape. So here's a friend's pond that I helped work on. This is the beginning. This is dug out. He wanted to have a little bog garden section here with a wall that divided it and just and then a deeper pond basin here. He built it into the side of his front yard garden that's fenced in, because he does live in a neighborhood with little kids and things like that. And it just filled with rainwater. And after that, we looked at it and he made some adjustments. He knew that he needed to make more of a wall between the bog garden and the basin. He added this little shelf here so we could have more dimensions and include plants that needed to be out of the water a little bit more. And he's continuing to reshape this pond in other ways by adding on to the sides. But the next step from there was to put the liner in and then let it fill with rainfall. This is one of those liners. They're often a rubber, synthetic rubber. Just make sure you get one that's for pond uses, for fish ponds is what you can look at. And then here it is at one stage. He's got his little bog going over here. He gets these pitcher plants from the native plant sales, and you don't add animals. That's something important to consider. I think Cope's gray tree frogs found him pretty soon after he put this pond in. And he's got other squirrel tree frogs. He's got lots of birds that enjoy this area, but they will find their way. And then this is it at another, I don't know what all those flags are for. He's always doing something, but it's a really nice feature. He loves it. It's made his time in his yard more worthwhile. He spends a lot of time out there, and he can have a lot more different plants now that he has these different types of habitats. Pond maintenance, and this is one of my this is just a plant holding area I have in my yard, but even these plant holding areas are really valuable habitats. Sometimes you can see this this little racer I saw here when I was about to start cleaning up some of the dead pickerel weed leaves. He was using it. I've had several different frog species get in there and lay eggs. So you want to wait until a good time to clean out the sediment if you have these ponds, because these ponds, these small ponds, you know, all of these plants are going to decompose and they can fill themselves in. That's one reason why you start with at least 3 feet, or, you know, not at least 3 feet is pretty good for these, but because if it was just a foot deep, it would fill in very quickly. So you do want to get rid of some of that old vegetative growth on top, and that you would do in the spring, early spring, because insects and lizards, everything are using some of these dead materials over winter. But within the basin of the pond, or I know this is a bucket basically, you do want to scoop out some of that sediment and some of the leaves, but leaving a layer on the bottom so that things can kind of take cover under there in the winter. And finally, a lot of reasons people don't want ponds, or if they have a pond, they immediately want a fountain or add fish to it, is because they don't want to have, you know, mosquitoes breeding on their property any more than they already do. So I use this with all my ponds, especially if you're getting started and you're putting in your first pond and you don't have the wildlife there yet to keep mosquitoes in check. Using these little donuts, the biological mosquito control dunks is pretty great. And every now and then I'll even put them in, I'll break off, you know, a quarter of one and put it in a pond if I notice more of them, even when I have wildlife that are kind of taking care. You know, bats and birds and lizards and frogs, they're all hitting your mosquito population and stuff too. So that's part of it, but you can always intervene and assist a little bit, since it's kind of an unnatural situation that you're making. All right, and then these are just some of my frogs that enjoy my yard right now. I've gotten up to 14 species and hoping to get a couple more. And the more plants I add, I feel like the more opportunities to attract a lot of times it's new insects or things to my yard, but it's all exciting. And let's see. All right, and that's my presentation. If you all have any questions.
Thank you, Erin. I see a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
Gail asked how to prevent algae from growing in the pond without water circulation.
Right. No, that's a great question. So again, your amphibians are big algae eaters. That's going to help. But if you know, in the beginning you have algae forming a lot and you don't have.
Oh, we've lost you, or at least I'm not hearing you.
Shade to it. Also, if you add more plants, they will help sort of take away the nutrients that are feeding that algae. So adding more plants to your pond is going to kind of outcompete the algae. You can also go in there, especially if it's smaller, and manually remove, you know, scoop out some algae if you need to, but algae is not a bad thing. If you have a time of year where you're not seeing a lot of wildlife use it, but the algae is really thick, you could try adding, one of those little, the little discs that are kind of disturbing the water. I don't know what they're called. You put them in bird baths sometimes, but I use that every now and then in still water, but you don't want it to be permanently there. But those are good, those little solar fountains, to use those occasionally.
Okay, we have another question from Lori. And your friend's front yard pond, does he have a location where overflow goes out downslope, or does he just let it overflow into the yard as needed during heavy rains?
Yeah, good question. So that position, let me think. His pond is not particularly at a low spot in his yard. That wasn't a consideration that he used to situate his pond there. So no, it would just overflow, and there's no problem with that. He could even that's right, because around it is the rest of his garden, so it really just waters kind of the rest of his garden. We did think about that with which plants. He's moved a bunch of those plants around, so plants that don't like to have wet feet that are beyond the margin, he's kind of moved them to a different area of the yard. So yeah, that's another way. So strategically putting your pond somewhere where if water overflows, it's, doing the job of watering some other plants that might have higher water requirements. So.
Okay. All right. Well, those are the only